Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Elliot, your WebEx producer, and I'll be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you experience technical difficulties, please send a message to the WebEx producer using the Q&A panel. You may also dial 1-866-779-3239 and receive technical support assistance. During the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode, and as a reminder, this event is being recorded for rebroadcast. For best viewing experience, please click View in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, and then uncheck where it says Show Participants Without Video. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, enjoy today's presentation. I would now like to introduce your speaker for today, Ann Maltese, Director of People Insights at Quantum Workplace, and Shane McFreely, PhD, Leading Researcher at Quantum Workplace. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to be here today and to talk about how to build a magnetic culture. So to give you a little bit of background on Shane and myself, my name is Ann Maltese, and again, I'm the Director of People Insights at Quantum Workplace. I've been partnering with organizations, helping them think through employee engagement, performance management, retention, kind of all things that are important these days for the past 14 years. And really what a wild ride it has been for the past 2 years or almost 2 years. So excited to be here today, and hopefully this webinar will inspire some ideas for you. And I'll turn it over to Shane for a quick introduction.
Everyone, my name is Shane McFeely. I am an organizational psychologist. I'm also the lead researcher at Quantum Workplace. So I get to study ways to make work more engaging and make teams more productive and really just improve the employee experience. So I like to understand why people love their jobs and really how to make work awesome. I'm joining you today from Omaha, Nebraska. And first and foremost, I just am very thankful and appreciative to all the veterans on the call today for their service, their sacrifice on this Veterans Day. We're definitely thinking about you. And also in the spirit of Thanksgiving later this month, I'm also very thankful to be talking with you all today about this idea of building a magnetic culture and how to attract and engage and retain your workforce. But let's talk a little bit about how we're going to spend our time today. So Anne's going to talk a little bit and talk through some of the employee engagement trends that we've been seeing through our data and from our customers. Quantum Workplace is able to organize and operate what's called the Best Places to Work contest, where we get to hear from hundreds of thousands of employee voices across the United States each year about their employee experience. And we're going to start talking about some of the insights that we saw from this year's data. That I'm going to come and talk a little bit about this idea of the great transformation. You may have heard of the great resignation, but we really want to challenge that idea and reshift our focus about how we can take this opportunity to really refocus on what's going to be most important to improving the employee experience. And then we're going to be talking through what are those top 6 drivers of employee engagement and really trying to give some practical advice about how to improve some of the levers of engagement and really capture this time of transformation. And then finally, Anne's going to wrap us up to talk through some strategic advice for HR leaders. We're going to get into, where can we start with all this information? And then we'll kind of close out today with some questions and hopefully some responses and maybe some answers in there as well. So feel free to put your questions there in the chat box and we'll address them there at the end. So Anne, without further ado.
Great. So before we start to give you tips later in this webinar, we really want to take a beat and review what's been happening with employee engagement, especially in the past 20 months or so, because this is really important context to understand some of the current challenges that are taking place right now in the workplace and really the opportunity that it's at our hands right now. So looking back from 2009 and then up until today, or rather 2020 on this slide, we can see as Quantum Workplace has been measuring engagement, we have pretty much stable levels of engagement for a long time. Between 2015 and 2016, we did revise our definition and our measurement of engagement a little bit. That's where we can see that dotted line. We're really defining it as the strength of the mental and emotional connection employees have with their work, their team, and their organization. We really believe all three of those factors matter and are important for not just employees' experience and employee success, but business success as well. Once we revised that, you can see again, we had pretty much a stable period between 2016 and 2019. But really, what we want to have stand out on this slide is 2020. And let's reflect on the year of 2020. It really wasn't an easy year for many of us. And in fact, it was a very challenging year. But if we think about what happened to the workplace in that time, we were sending employees to work from home, or if we had on-site essential employees, we were really putting safety precautions in place, new processes in place. We had other challenges going on in the workplace that really forced us to communicate differently, try new tactics to communicate. We were really offering more flexibility than maybe ever before. And really, as one of my team members puts it, we were treating our human capital as humans. And we saw that have a positive impact on employee engagement. So in 2020, we actually saw the highest levels of employee engagement ever recorded. And again, that cynical view might be people were just thankful to have a job. For many workplaces or many businesses, it was a challenging time. But again, what we saw time and time or month by month in those trends is that perceptions of communication were improving, trust in leaders were improving, perceptions of the culture supporting in our health and well-being were improving. And so a lot of what we had to do differently, perhaps because of the pandemic beginning in early 2020, was actually positively impacting employee engagement. But as time progressed, we did see those really high and strong levels of employee engagement in January of 2021. But since then, we've started to see engagement slip just a bit. It's starting to show cracks. And we are going to talk through some of the specifics later in today's webinar about what is going on and how we can really make sense of this and try to improve employee engagement again. But we do want to call out that those high levels in 2020 are starting to go away. And that really creates this sense of opportunity and this sense of urgency. And I think that's why Shane and I are so excited to be here today with you to not just hyper focus on maybe some of the challenges and some of the problems or issues that many organizations are facing today, but rather what can we be doing about it to solve this? And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Shane, and he's going to walk us through some of the economic and labor market and turnover trends taking place right now.
Yeah, so Anne just kind of talked about the transformation of employee engagement that we saw in our data. However, many of you are quite well aware that there's also been a transformation in terms of turnover, unemployment, retention, and employees' confidence in the workplace and the opportunities that present themselves out there. So when we think back throughout the past 2 years, there's really been quite a wild ride in terms of the economy, and in terms of some of this labor market data, which I'm going to kind of go over here in right now. So when we think about the recovery of the labor market, when we think back to April of 2020, as much as we may not want to, we were almost at about 15% unemployment. So many employers had to do reduction in force, and some organizations and small businesses maybe even had to change the way that their operations ran or close their business altogether as the pandemic sort of took hold. And we saw that kind of pandemic peak of seasonally adjusted unemployment. But we can compare that to just a few months ago, where there had been a reduction in that number to almost as low as 5% unemployment, starting to show a recovery in this unemployment level. But now I think employers and many of you on the call are likely managing here another emerging challenge to the labor market, and that has been coined as the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle. Sometimes they're talking about the turnover tsunami, but really this idea that many employees are leaving their organizations for other opportunities. It might be a complete career change or a change in their industry. It might be leaving the job market altogether and trying to retire early. And what we saw throughout the months of April, throughout the summer of this year, were almost 4 million voluntary turnovers in the United States each month. And so had quite a large quit rate that they often refer to this as. And this has been really one of the largest rates that they've seen since we've started tracking this metric. And much of this is due to kind of a change in how people are thinking about the job market. So if we can go to just the next slide there, the job market has really improved, or at least perceptions and confidence in the job market has really improved. So some of this voluntary turnover can be due in large part to employees having greater confidence that they can maybe find something better or some more advancement opportunities elsewhere in the market. So we started tracking some of these confidence metrics at the beginning of this year and showed some increases in the item. I'm confident I could get a job as good as my current one, which was up about 14 percentage points from about March to about June of this year. And then and a 7 percentage point increase in the item, I am confident that I could find a job that pays as well as my current job over the same period. Again, this is in United States numbers, and it's just kind of looking at the beginning part of this year, just showing that there is some increased optimism about opportunities elsewhere. But when we think about another big metric that we kind of pay attention to is the intent to stay. So we also noticed that one of the key metrics that we track in our best places to work contest is this item. It would take a lot to get me to leave this organization. This is somewhat of our intent to stay item and is really critical in our measurement of employee engagement. And so you can see that in April and in December of 2020, we really had the highest levels of this intent to stay since we started tracking, as many organizations and many employees were starting to navigate this COVID-19 pandemic, trying to stay with the job that they know, and probably not the best time to be looking for jobs. But in more recent months, sort of this May through July of this year, we started to see this metric normalize back to maybe its pre-pandemic levels, showing about 1 in 4 employees who indicate that they might be open to leaving for a better offer, or leaving for a better organization. And so kind of like how Ann said, if we're just solely looking at some of this economic and labor market activity, HR professionals and HR leaders might get a little discouraged that, much of this is out of our control, and that, it's a product of sort of a lot bigger forces than just our organization. But we also have some data to say that, how can we build that magnetic culture? So we look at how highly engaged employees are more likely to stay in their organization. So there's large discrepancies in the intent to stay, at least for the next year or so, for employees who are highly engaged versus not. We found that 88% of highly engaged employees agreed that they would be staying at their current organization in the next year, and that compares to less than 50%, less than half of those who are not highly engaged. We also found that highly engaged employees were about 4.4 times less likely to be actively searching and applying for other jobs on the market compared with those who are not engaged. So taken together, these findings really show that some of the issues of retention can really be improved just by local level working conditions, and they can improve retention and make your organizational culture more magnetic and more turnover proof. And so for the rest of this presentation today, we'd really like to focus in on this idea of how can we make our cultures more magnetic, and how can we sort of take this idea of the great resignation or the great retention and really think about the great transformation. So where do we go from here? You might be looking at this slide and wonder where this guy forgot to finish his slides today, and this guy doesn't actually know where we're going. But really, we couldn't find a graphic or a bullet that really could capture this idea of moving from the doom and gloom of the great resignation and being kind of resigned to just being a part of this wave that's happening. And it can sometimes feel like we're fighting a losing battle, but in reality, I think this is now more than ever an opportunity and a time in which we can shift that mindset and think about the opportunity that really presents itself. So there's now an opportunity, I think, now more than ever, to transform the way in which we retract, the way that we recruit, engage, and really build our cultures to be more inclusive, a culture that's more engagement and performance focused, maybe a greater focus on employee well-being and employee choice, treating, as Anne said, humans first and not just human capital, and really transform our method of management that connects employees to the mission and success of the organization. So really, for the rest of this presentation, we want to take the time to focus this conversation on how to capture this opportunity, sort of throw out that traditional management playbook and transform the employee experience for the future of work.
Great. Thank you, Shane. Obviously, this is something that we are incredibly passionate about, and we have the opportunity to work with HR professionals every day or other leaders in the workplace. And we know that your jobs are hard right now. We know that you're going through a lot of challenges. And so, again, we feel like the best way that we can help you is to actually think about what is the opportunity here? How do we get out of the mode of just maybe trying to solve the immediate problems in front of us, but instead really think about how do we create a workplace culture moving forward that's sustainable, that is engaging, and that really puts us in a good position moving forward to attract and retain talent. So we're going to go over the top 6 drivers of employee engagement, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the perceptions look like currently and maybe how those compare to 2020 levels, and really equip you with some tips or some ideas to take back to your workplaces moving forward. So the first thing that we want to talk about is really around communication. And you can see here we have the survey item, when the organization makes changes, I understand why. And we can see that we saw some spikes in the percent of employees who could strongly agree or agree to this item as 2020 transpired. And now we're back to actually pre-pandemic, or a little bit worse than pre-pandemic levels. And if we think about what was happening in 2020, we were really forced to operate differently again, whether it was because we had employees working from home or we had employees working on site or essential employees that maybe had to operate a little bit differently. All of those changes really forced us to communicate differently. And we were trying new tactics to reach employees. We were maybe trying to communicate more frequently. We were talking about different messages. We really saw leaders talking about health and safety of employees. We saw social justice kind of come into the workplace, maybe more than it ever has before, in that conversation about it. We had leaders talking about burnout and mental health. And really, as we saw maybe one another struggling a little bit, our leaders were talking about that. And that communication didn't go unnoticed. In fact, that is some of the reason why we saw the spikes in perceptions of communication in 2020. So not just communication about the business and maybe those efforts we were making, but also the tone and the messages that were being communicated about as well. And maybe some of those practices weren't sustainable. So we saw a lot of organizations maybe doing weekly all hands as an opportunity to bring everyone together when we were first working all remotely. Or we saw some organizations really maybe send email updates on a weekly basis. At Quantum Workplace, our CEO actually was sending out a daily Slack message. So we use Slack internally, and he would tell us about his day. He would tell us about what's going on in Quantum Workplace, some of maybe the business successes we were seeing, if we had new customers coming into the mix that we wanted to celebrate and be proud of, but also sometimes just the challenges of his day or his life and his family. And that was great, but it is hard to ask for a leader or anyone to really keep something like that up. And so while that was effective, our opportunity now is really, I think, more about how can we create a way of communicating to our employees in a way that we can sustain, in a way that is engaging and honors some of what was impactful or effective about communication taking place in 2020. So this is really our opportunity to define consistent, reliable processes for how change is communicated and by whom. So really this boils down to don't make it easy for employees to miss key communications, but also on the flip side of that, don't make it hard either for them to find those key messages. Really, what is kind of our go-to way when we have something to communicate or we have something to announce that employees can hear that information or they can find that information. But communication can't just be all senior leaders or executive leaders. You really have to bring in all leaders. So that includes your people leaders or your managers into the mix as well. So we have to give our managers resources or maybe the messages. Sometimes we have to give them a little bit of Q&A in case they get questions from their employees. And we have to hold them accountable for communicating messages. Again, this is especially important as we have more than ever before hybrid employees or remote employees to think about what is that role of a manager and making sure that information is easily accessed within the organization and that they can also be fielding any questions as well. And that last point, it's really our opportunity to communicate about changes that's relevant to employees. Maybe some of what we liked in 2020 as employees is that we were hearing messages that mattered to us. We were hearing about our health and safety. We were hearing about what the organization was doing to protect us, or maybe the social injustices or other things going on, especially in the United States, that mattered to our life and our families. And even if there are simply business things to communicate about inside of the organization, and that's clearly a lot of what communication is, making sure that message is relevant to employees. How does this impact me? And kind of really what does this mean for me? I think that's the message that sometimes we fail to deliver to employees for them to really understand what this is about and how I'm part of maybe the changes that are taking place. And so really trying to adopt these new strategies is going to help you ensure that employees hear consistent messages and they understand if and how they're impacted. It's going to give employees insight into thought processes behind big decisions. So oftentimes we know if we're rolling out a new strategy, if we are delivering a new product, if maybe we're making a pivot in our business, a lot of thought goes behind those decisions, whether it's our senior leaders or others kind of meeting together. But sometimes our employees don't have visibility into that. They fail to kind of know how much work went into a decision that's being made. And so, again, kind of letting employees know we did put a lot of thought into this is an important part of how we can move forward. And then finally, it helps us avoid just the rumor mill or the gossip. So if we don't give enough information in our messages, sometimes employees or people can just create their own reality. We kind of fill in the gaps with what we think. So very clear and effective communication can, again, make sure that we're all on the same page. We all know what's actually facts versus fiction, and we can create that environment where employees really do appreciate the communication taking place. So moving on to our second trend that we want to talk about, it's related to communication, but it's a little bit more broad, and it's about trust in leadership. And here, we want to again think back to what was happening in 2020, where at some months we were seeing 9 out of 10 employees being able to strongly agree that I trust our senior leaders to lead the company to future success. And what did that look like? So if I think back to leaders I get to interact with, whether they're the ones at Quantum Workplace that I am peers with or other leaders in organizations, we saw a lot of leaders working from their homes, just like many of us were. Maybe that's not the case for everyone, but the interesting thing about when we were working from home and maybe using Zoom video or Teams or other video software, we got to see people in their home. And maybe we saw those leaders a little bit more casually dressed than we often do. Maybe we saw their families or their pets or their dogs kind of in the room with them. And it really made leaders a little bit more relatable, a little bit more like us. We got to see them as humans. And again, they were seeing us as humans as well. And that actually did have a positive impact in the trust in leadership. So leadership and trust is not just about how the business is doing. That's certainly part of it. Finances, revenue, the other KPIs that matter definitely inspire trust, but so do how we see our leaders and how we see them behave and being able to see them in a more relatable way. And so again, now we're seeing those levels dip down a little bit, and we really want to be thinking about how do we rebuild this up? Can we regain that trust in senior leaders that we had in early 2020 and throughout 2020? So think about this as an opportunity to create space for leaders to interact with employees in a personable, relatable way. Again, you've heard us say this a few times right now, but your employees just aren't employees. And your human capital isn't just human capital. We are humans. So how do we interact with one another and build that trust as humans together? But of course, we also want to communicate about the things that tell us whether the business is doing well or not. So making sure that we're consistently, regularly communicating about key business metrics and the overall performance. And then finally, giving an opportunity for employees to engage with leaders outside of the standard office environment. This is a little bit tricky because we know some places and plenty of people are still operating kind of in that COVID standards or regulations, if you will. But how do we get to know one another? How do we see where do we have commonality? So I don't just see leaders as maybe the folks in the ivory tower, so to speak, but really people like me that I can trust and believe in, and that I enjoy showing up to work for and work with every day. And so this is going to help you provide more leadership visibility. It's really going to allow communication to feel more authentic because, again, when we can be people and we can be humans with one another, our communication kind of follows suit. It's going to increase confidence in the organization's ability to succeed. We all want to work at a place that we're proud about and that we're excited about and that we think that we have confidence in the future about. So we're really trying to create this environment where we're not just confident in the business, but we're confident in the people leading the business, and we feel that we can trust them and that we're all in this together. The third trend that we'll talk about, and this will be the final one that I'll discuss with you before turning it over to Shane, is work-life balance and flexibility. And what we see on this slide is a specific survey item that we include in our employee engagement surveys, as well as our best places to work survey that reads, "My job gives me the flexibility to meet the needs of my work and personal life." And we can see how we had a little bit of spike in 2020, maybe not as much as we would expect, but we're actually now at the lowest levels since prior to January 2020 of perceptions of flexibility. And so again, if we think back to what was happening in 2020, a lot of employees were sent to work from home in around the March 2020 timeframe. And in some ways, that might seem like the ultimate flexibility, but we also had kids at home if they were parents and the schools were shut down, or we maybe had spouses or roommates at home with us. And a lot of things weren't open. We weren't leaving the house much. So maybe in many ways, we were kind of stuck and not flexible, not really able to enjoy kind of the environment that we were in very much in 2020. And we saw a lot of organizations reacting to that by providing more days off or mental health days. We saw more organizations than ever before allowing summer Fridays, where maybe the workplace shuts down earlier than typical business hours in summer, or maybe even extending summer hours to be all throughout 2020. And so there were a lot of things that organizations were doing. And now, as we kind of are in this little bit of a gray area where some things are normal and some things aren't, we're seeing kind of that impact on employees. And this is certainly part of the story is certainly where you're working. We know that more employees or people than ever before want flexibility in where they work. Our research shows that 68% of employees want a hybrid work environment where they go into the office sometimes and they also are able to work from home when they choose. 21% prefer to be all remote. I don't want to go to the office. Maybe I've enjoyed my experience working from home. Only 11% want to be on site. And so in there, there's certainly some individual differences. Everyone may have their own unique perspective, but we do have people that maybe have experienced some of that flexibility and want it moving forward. But I think beyond that, it's not just where you work, but also just kind of that broader definition of flexibility. This going on to the next slide, as we think about really what the opportunity is that we have, it's an opportunity to acknowledge employees' lives outside of work. And that reminds me a lot of Adam Grant. I don't know if we have any Adam Grant followers or fans in this webinar, but a few weeks ago, he posted something that was to the effect that we should be designing work around people's lives instead of um, people's lives around their work. And that was a wildly popular post. I saw that shared on LinkedIn. I saw that shared on Twitter. I saw it on Instagram. So clearly it struck a chord with a lot of people that are really trying to think about, how do I get to be a human and have all of the things in my life that matter to me and be able to prioritize that and get to work in maybe a way that makes the most sense for me. And so this is going to entail creating new norms, new business rules for operating that maybe allows more flexibility than we've had before. It's going to be about recognizing that there are individual differences, individual preferences that different employees have about what works best for them and what makes them most productive. And this is really the ultimate opportunity to think about, how do we compete for talent? Knowing that there are so many individual differences, but knowing that a lot of people want flexibility because they've had that taste of it maybe in 2020. How do we continue to offer more of that and really create an environment where people can thrive and people can be engaged and people can perform well, but they're doing it maybe a little bit more on their terms? And so not only will this help us compete for talent and retain that talent, but really having some of these norms is going to allow you to avoid mixed messages about work-life balance and flexibility. I think that's important. We've been hearing that from many of the organizations that we work with, where sure, you can work from home, but maybe we're checking to see when you send emails. Are you online during the day? And so that can create some confusion for employees to say, I thought you trusted me. I thought I could work from home and I was just taking my dog for a walk or grabbing lunch. So we want to make sure that there's really healthy norms and practices so that people don't feel like their presence online is a function that they are working or kind of a sign that they're working. It's going to help employees feel supported and valued. And again, kind of thinking about them as people and not just employees. So this is a huge topic and it relates to our next trend. I'm going to turn it back over to Shane to talk about that one as well as two more that follow.
Yeah, I think that the idea of this work-life balance and flexibility, it's really intertwined with this greater focus on employee health and well-being, and even mental health. And during the pandemic, we really saw elevated levels on the item that reads, "Our culture supports my health and well-being." And that makes sense. It's kind of intuitive as many organizations move to protect their workers during a global health crisis. We had additional safety precautions, increased flexibility in where to work, and in some cases, entire workforces were brought to the home. Employees really noticed these changes, and kind of the message at that time was probably pretty easy for leaders to say, we're here to support and protect your well-being throughout this global pandemic. More recently we start to see some of these levels come down, and these perceptions have dropped somewhat, and maybe that's due to organizations rethinking the return to the workplace, rethinking how much remote work and how and when. I think many leaders are debating the efficacy of some of these decisions, and now there's debates about vaccine and vaccine mandates, and a lot of things coming down the pike there. So I think that there's also now a greater attention from leaders as well about mental health. Burnout was happening before the pandemic. If anything, I think the pandemic really just really brought to light and put a flashlight on the idea that mental health is important, not only to safety and well-being, but also ultimately to productivity and retention. So health and well-being is obviously still top of mind to everyone at this moment as we sort of navigate what comes next during this pandemic or this time. But I think there's some things that organizational leaders and HR professionals can really do to really make a successful employee health and well-being practice. So it's important to consider all the ways in which we can support and our employees, not only their physical health, but their mental health as well. And this may also extend to other members of your employees' family as well. So often, your employees are the primary caregivers for their other family members, like children, parents, siblings, grandparents, maybe, and of course, as I mentioned, this idea of increased stress and burnout truly affecting productivity and engagement, and sometimes retention. Some of what we hear about this great resignation is people thinking that they're so burnt out on their job they may need to leave the industry, or leave maybe the career that they've kind of grown their whole life. And when we look at some of our data from the best places to work, we often ask about, what are some of the newest benefits that you're offering now at your organization. What we've really seen in the last year is really a proliferation of some of these mental health benefits that have kind of been added, as HR professionals have really added a lot of these programs. And so now more than ever, I think people are shifting their mindset away from their benefits package being these short-term perks, like maybe free lunches, happy hours, or a beer fridge, or something that might have at one point been, a cool perk for people to maybe attract a few people, but also moving more towards this idea of long-term success and sort of long-term health and well-being. So providing parental leave, and giving access to mental health apps, and just being aware of what mental health support is really out there, in addition to sort of time for wellness time, and maybe even some stipends for wellness and gym memberships. Obviously those were before, but I think we're seeing a greater focus on those being a value add. And I think that this focus on health and well-being are really going to build a benefits program that are going to meet the needs of all employees. It's going to provide it to be more equitable. And in the long term, what we're hoping is that these kind of rethinking of these benefits package can improve employee performance in the long term, and reduce some of that burnout and stress, and increasing that productivity. And ultimately, what we're trying to do here, like kind of the name of this is building a magnetic culture, is to improve that employee value proposition, and making sure that you're competitive in the talent marketplace. And one of the ways in which people are looking more and more so are, what are the things that you offer to support my and my family's health and well-being. The next one that I'm going to go through here is talking about one that is probably near and dear to everyone on this call, and it's really been one of the most consistent drivers of employee engagement since we've started tracking, and that's employee recognition. Employees, by their very nature of being human, they want to know that the work that they're doing is on track. They want to know that they're contributing to the success of the organization and being recognized for that. So this is also a metric that we've seen dip slightly in more recent months and sort of seeing a more normalization back to maybe pre-pandemic times. But it's really the idea that employees want to feel that they are being successful and that they have opportunities to grow and improve. So when we think about what are some tips for success in trying to improve this employee recognition, it's something that I think we can all work on. There's always room for improvement for people leaders and even myself. Looking at even on our team, making sure that being consistent about it. It's kind of one of those things that sometimes we put off, and then we're like, "Gosh, I should really recognize that person for all the things that they've done over the past quarter," and it becomes a little bit like ebbs and flows a little bit, which is okay. So start with where you're at, but also the first thing that you could do is acknowledge and connect the mission and business success of the organization to what the employee is doing. Many employees derive their appreciation for what they do each and every day by connecting their personal mission to the success of the organization. The other thing that I would say is having a balanced feedback approach when you have employees, by showing employees first where they're successful, where they're really aligned with where we're going, but also where they have opportunities to grow and develop. And when I say this, many of you might be thinking to kind of a traditional sandwich method where you're giving positive feedback, then negative feedback, and then positive feedback. And really that's not what we want to do. That can those sort of techniques have been shown to really confuse people sometimes. Sometimes people don't know where to focus then, because I'm doing good, but I'm not sure how I'm doing. And it's also shown that some people just cherry pick some of those ideas, kind of what they wanted to hear and what they wanted to get out of that conversation. So really trying to make time for balance in both the positive feedback and showing where employees are doing really well, and but also showing here's some areas for development and some ways that you can improve. And then finally you got to making sure that we can individualize and tailor your recognition and your feedback and on an approach that's like based on employee preferences. So it might be whether they're in office or remote. Sometimes now that a lot more employees are remote, they're not around all day a day to get that kind of in the moment recognition. So it's almost a more purposeful effort that you have to have, or people leaders need to have, to be able to reach out to them. Some people really like that public recognition and kind of shouting it to the rest of the organization of what they did, and some prefer that personalized note about what they did. And the way to really that people leaders can really truly identify and figure out what works best is really just to talk to their teams about what their preferences are, and that can happen through one-on-one conversations and team conversations as well. But ultimately, this increased focus on employee recognition, again, one of the large drivers of employee engagement, but it also helps employees find meaning in their work. It really helps improve not only individual team engagement or individual engagement, but also engagement of the whole team, because you can start to create a culture of recognition on that team, because it sort of gets a little bit where everyone kind of feels like they want to be part of that recognition. And again, connecting the employee purpose, like what they come today, each and every day at work to do, and connecting that with the organizational mission can really make an improvement there as well. Okay, the last trend that we're going to be talking about today, career growth and development. So we have seen career growth and development similar to recognition. It's been a consistent driver of employee engagement. It's also one of those areas that is often most cited when we're talking about employee retention. So when we hear about stay interviews or stay surveys, that's one of the ones that keep people around. When we're looking through exit survey data, that's often one of the ones that kind of pops up in terms of why folks might be leaving for other opportunities, which has big implications when we talk about the great resignation and trying to make our culture more turnover proof. Employees are going to stay at organizations where they feel like they have a future and that they can have an ability to grow and develop their skills and experiences within their current organization. Part of what we're seeing right now in terms of the great resignation are that employees are just seeing more possibilities and opportunities for growth at other organizations compared to where they're at. And so it's kind of leading to some of this job hopping and this perception that if I want to grow as a human and as an employee, I have to look elsewhere. And that's what we kind of want to transform our thinking about and reshift how we can do that. So some ways in which I think that we can, turn the tide on this, as I mentioned, making it kind of an imperative when we think about retention is revisiting these programs. So often I think people equate career growth and development with moving into a management position. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that a lot of people who are not, in fact, a majority who are not currently in a management position actually don't even have that really desire to be a manager. They really love the work that they do, and they really don't derive their meaning and work from being in that sort of management position, but rather just being really good and expanding their skills and their abilities in what they're currently doing. So it's important to revisit and understand what type of career growth and experiences that people can gain within your organization. So often when we are kind of designing these programs, we think about how the career growth and development programs can really benefit the organization, or maybe how it can benefit our team by having expansive growth. And what we can kind of shift our thinking about is how this is going to benefit the individual employee. Sometimes we need to emphasize their personal growth and professional growth at the same time, above and beyond what we're trying to fill and succession plans at our own organization. And that's really where retention can come in, is aligning what individual employees want for themselves and their careers with what is needed by the organization. And I think now more than ever, these programs and opportunities, they have to be equitable and they have to be inclusive to all employees. They can't be exclusionary based on race or gender or age, and they can't be exclusionary based on in office or hybrid or remote. We should really have these development opportunities for available to everyone. And the primary way in which you can individualize and tailor these programs is really with really great people leaders who are capable of having these one-on-one conversations about development and not being protective of their talent, which is really easy to do, and saying, oh gosh, I think you're doing really good on my team. And thinking through, okay, ultimately, where do you want to be? So having those conversations, having very talented people leaders who are able to have those conversations. And I think that this will kind of help shift people leaders in their mindset from development that only benefits their team and more towards development and advancement that really focuses on the individual. That's the type I think that is folks want, and that is really good for retention. And what we're hearing from those exit surveys about how you could have retained me is by the career growth that I was looking for. So I think with that, that was our last sort of driver there. And it's going to wrap us up a little bit by providing some advice about where to start on some of this great transformation, and some advice and some practical starting points for HR leaders.
Great. So, with that, we know that there's a lot of information today. We know that things are very fast paced in organizations right now, and sometimes it just feels like you're putting fires out every day. So, these are just a few things that can get you started. First and foremost, what we'll call a comprehensive listening strategy to understand employee feedback. So, what does that mean? It means that we're listening to our employees at different moments, at maybe different times throughout the year. And what we see and what we recommend, and see it as most effective, is really still leaning into that annual employee engagement survey. That's going to give us the best measure of how employees are engaged and what drives their engagement or what influences their engagement, as well as some of the other perceptions that we should be aware of. So kind of think about that as your cornerstone in terms of surveys, and then building or listening around that. So many organizations see benefit in a new hire survey. So are we delivering on the experience that we promise to people in that hiring process? And so that can really help you make sure that onboarding and kind of the first experience inside of an organization is one that employees are satisfied with and that engages them from the get-go, or whether there's any opportunities to solve for. Exit surveys on the far end of that bookend are also a good opportunity to hear why people are leaving you. Are there things inside of the organization that maybe push them out, so to speak? So things that really were dissatisfying or disengaging to their experience. Maybe they didn't feel respected. Maybe they had a bad relationship with their manager and those things drove them to leave, versus things that maybe pulled them out of the organization. We're seeing a lot of that right now, where maybe there's higher pay or there's better benefits, there's more flexibility over here, so I'm going to hop over here. And really that can help you think about, where is the magnet? I know we've been using that terminology a lot in today's webinar, but what's the magnet inside of your organization that can keep people but also engage them? And then, of course, using pulse surveys throughout the year as well. We saw pulse surveys really explode in 2020 when everyone was working from home. We needed to make sure that they had what they needed and that they were feeling supported. And we're seeing pulse surveys still be wildly popular and very effective and valuable for organizations now. So again, really thinking about, what is that comprehensive listening strategy that we have, where we're collecting feedback at key moments and at key times throughout the year, so we have that good, robust understanding of what our employees think. It's also important to connect people analytics to business metrics. So think about this in terms of, what was the employee feedback, maybe at the time of our engagement survey, that's associated with folks who have left us. So we do a lot of analyses that looks at voluntary turnover inside of organizations, and then we backtrack a little bit and we look at how people responded to surveys and where we can make predictions and make kind of what led them to maybe leave the organization. But it doesn't have to just be turnover or even kind of those HR specific metrics, if you will. Really connecting employee feedback to profitability, to revenue, to safety can help you make connections in, how are people operating, how are people behaving, or what are those perceptions that maybe lead to our business success. And really the key here is, once we have those connections, we're able to get a lot more leaders oftentimes bought into this, because engagement is not just about engagement's sake. This isn't a feel-good activity, and the same is true for culture. It's about creating an environment that helps our employees be successful and our business be successful. So the more that we do those analytics moving forward, the more that our leaders really understand this is integral to our business success. Make investments that strengthen your culture, and really be thinking about, if we could solve everything right now, of course we might try, but that would burn a lot of our resources, it would burn a lot of time. Where are the key opportunities that we have? And really thinking about the things that attract and retain employees. And we're seeing, just as an example, a lot of organizations offer more flexibility because they know that's going to help them attract employees, or it's going to help retain employees. But if we're having employees work hybrid or remote, and they generally have a bad day-to-day experience, they're not going to stay working for us for long. So what are the investments that we need to make where we kind of reimagine what things look like moving forward to be effective? And then finally, reviewing your employee value proposition. We see a lot of organizations maybe promise things that really are centric around everyone working in the office, or maybe things that just in 2021 and moving forward into 2022 aren't necessarily true about that organization anymore. If people are leaving us because they don't feel like there's any development investment in employees, or we don't have the benefits that are really equitable for all employees, or people don't feel valued, then maybe we should stop promising that or advertising that to candidates. So all of this is really that opportunity to reflect and to reimagine what could our workplace look like moving forward. And yes, that certainly does take some work. It takes some time, but that is what is going to make organizations more successful than others moving forward, and really having that magnetic culture that's going to allow you to attract, recruit, and retain employees. So if you enjoyed the content in the slides today, and especially the data, we saw a few people ask for the slides. No, in addition to these slides, we also have 3 reports published that you can find on our website. One report really diving into remote work, one report really diving into the recent trends of employee engagement, and then the final report around turnover trends. So those are all accessible to you and can really help in some of your internal conversations, to have some data points to maybe back up your work. So with that, we have a few minutes left and we would love to tackle any questions. So if you have a question for us, feel free to submit it right now and we'll get to as many as we can. I'm actually going to turn it over to you, Shane, because I think the 2 questions I'm seeing top of the list right now maybe are best answered by you.
Yeah. So there were some questions here from both Jane and Nikki, a little bit about where some of this data comes from. Some of the stats on the labor market, that's really from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that would be for US only type look at that data. So those are coming strictly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. When we think about some of the survey questions that we kind of went over and some of those drivers of employee engagement, a lot of that is coming from our Best Places to Work contest. So the Best Places to Work contest is a national contest that is across 48 different regions now, and a few other kind of specialty trade magazines that really comes from all over the United States. We get to listen to about a little over 800,000 employees each year, and a couple thousand organizations and the employees within them. So, and if you go to this quantumworkplace.com/HRE, we're going to have those reports in there, and it's going to have a little bit more about the methodology. You can also see some better breakouts of and different filters of the data. So that'll probably give you some more information. Additionally, we're seeing some questions that are really talking about the deck available. I believe HRE is going to make that available. I think I read within 24 hours, and then it'll also be on that quantumworkplace.com/HRE website as well. So you'll be able to see the deck as well as the recording. And let's see. So some other questions that are coming on, and maybe this is a good question for you, Anne. How often do you recommend using a staff engagement survey?
Yeah, good question. So when it comes to that bigger employee engagement or staff engagement survey, and when I say big, it doesn't have to be a super long survey. We're often seeing, 30 or so items. That would be around the survey that we would recommend and partner with organizations on. We suggest that that happens annually and at a consistent time every year. So we know that even if the business is going well, if the business is going bad, if things are chaotic, that is our consistent touch point to listen to employees about things like manager effectiveness, trust and leadership, and also our measure of engagement. But an annual employee engagement survey is not enough, in our opinion. We know that different organizations are maybe at different maturity or sophistication levels when it comes to surveys. And of course, if you are manufacturing or logistics or have employees not at computers every day, it gets a little bit more challenging maybe to hear from them. But actually, our research shows that when employees have about 4 opportunities per year to share feedback in a survey, that's associated with the strongest engagement levels. So again, to recap that answer, we do want an annual employee engagement survey plus other surveys. What those other surveys look like might depend on how familiar and how used to your employees are in taking surveys, but about 4 times per year is a good fit for most organizations. And that correlates kind of with that perception that my opinion counts, they listen to me, and we're actually able to keep up with the feedback that I share.
And I think we have maybe time for one more. And this one I'm gonna throw over to you here, Anne.
Sure.
How do you start having these conversations with when top leaders are resistant, but lower level management and staff are vocally asking for this type of change?
Yeah. In my experience, having data is incredibly helpful. So if we can have survey data that shows kind of what employees want, if we can look at our top performers and maybe why our top performers stay and why our top performers leave, that can be incredibly important data, or just the data that we're sharing today. I think most leaders want kind of a business case, so to speak, for things. And so trying to make that business case can really balance what people want, or maybe some of the changes that are ahead of us, but also how that will benefit the business, even if it's maybe turbulent as we're going through change. So the more that you can bring data into those conversations, I think the more effective oftentimes those are. Great. There were a few more questions that we were not able to get to, so we may be able to follow up on those, but otherwise, hopefully the information that will be shared after today's webinar will have some great resources or some additional information for you. Again, thank you. We know that it is not an easy time in workplaces right now, and we appreciate all of you and what you do every day. And hopefully we shared some helpful information, and we're always happy to further partner with organizations. So visit our website or reach out to us if you need any additional support.
Thank you all.
Great. Take care.